Hey guys, tonight we're venturing into one of the strangest careers the Middle Ages had to offer. Not the knight in shining armour, not the wandering bard, but the man everyone needed and no one wanted to talk to, the medieval executioner. So before you get cozy, I'd really appreciate a quick like or even a subscribe. It helps way more than you know. And hey, I'm always curious where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment with your city and what time it is for you. Now lay back, close your eyes, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations, it's the year 1325. The good news, you have a steady job. The bad news, that job involves chopping people's heads off in front of a crowd that cheers louder for gore than for accuracy. You're the town executioner, a man officially sanctioned to do all the dirty work that everyone demands, but no one wants to talk to you about afterward. You wake up in your special little house on the edge of town. And yes, you're out on the edge for a reason. People don't want to live next door to the guy who spends his mornings sharpening an axe big enough to fell an oak tree. Your straw mattress squelches when you shift, alive with lice, and your wool blanket is stiff from grime. You scratch yourself awake and roll onto a floor that smells faintly of old blood. Because it is old blood. And here's the kicker, you don't even remember if it's yours. Historically, executioners were either born into it or forced into it. Maybe your father handed down the family trade like it was a prized farm, only with more screaming customers. Or maybe you were a thief caught stealing bread, given a choice between losing your hand or swinging the axe for the rest of your life. It's the medieval version of a terrible career pivot. Congratulations, you've gone from shoplifter to state-sanctioned butcher. And there are perks, sure, tax exemptions, free housing, sometimes even the right to keep pieces of the people you killed. Yes, human fat and bones were used in medieval medicine, a nice little side hustle for the enterprising executioner. Imagine clocking out of work and heading to the market with a bag of severed thumbs, hoping the apothecary gives you a good price. Forget retirement plans, your savings account is made of spare ribs. But here's the catch. Nobody wants you around. You're a walking bad omen. The butcher won't sell to you, the priest won't bless you, and if you sit down at the tavern, everyone else finds a reason to suddenly drink outside. Your kids grow up bullied, and your family can only marry into other executioner clans. You're privileged and cursed at the same time, a man both paid and shunned, like a medieval influencer with terrible PR. And then there are the nights. When the crowd is gone and the axe is silent, you lie in the dark listening to the echoes in your head. The botched beheading where the blade bounced. The prisoner who screamed long after the sentence was finished. The jeers when you missed your mark and had to swing again and again. Your dreams replay them in gruesome detail, but worse, they remix them. Sometimes it's your face in the noose. Sometimes it's your own family on the block. The line between memory and nightmare blurs until you wake drenched in sweat, scratching at your filthy blanket, praying for dawn. Alcohol becomes your lullaby. Beer, wine, whatever's cheapest and strongest. You drink enough to blur the edges of memory, though never enough to silence it completely. And in the morning, you drag yourself back to the scaffold, greeted by a crowd that sees you not as a man, but as a spectacle. They want clean kills, drama, blood. One slip, and their rage turns on you. A bad cut isn't just embarrassing, it's potentially fatal. So you stumble through each day, the crowd cheering while secretly despising you, your nights haunted by the ghosts of your own handiwork, a life of privilege that tastes like ashes. You're not just an executioner, you're the nightmare that never wakes up. And while you think that's grim, wait until you hear about the other jobs executioners were forced to take when they weren't busy swinging the axe. Because as it turns out, their side hustles were sometimes even stranger than their main profession. You might think swinging the axe was a full-time career, but the reality was stranger. Medieval towns treated their executioners like grotesque multi-tools, assigning them jobs that blurred the line between butcher, garbage collector, and surgeon. By day, you could be delivering punishment. By evening, you might be cleaning the streets of animal carcasses, and by nightfall you could find yourself lancing a boil on some wealthy merchant's backside because nobody else would touch him. Executioners were indispensable and yet utterly untouchable, which meant all the dirty work, literal and metaphorical, somehow fell into their hands. One of the most common side tasks was animal disposal. In towns without organised sanitation, dead horses, dogs and pigs were left to rot in the streets, stinking up entire neighbourhoods. Guess who was called to drag them out? You. Not only did you haul the carcasses, you were expected to strip them for usable parts. Animal fat could be boiled down, hides could be salvaged, and bones could be ground into fertiliser. The same hands that held the axe also scraped at horse carcass in the gutter. And since medieval people already associated executioners with filth, disease and death, no one minded piling another nauseating duty onto the list. But it did not stop there. In many towns, executioners doubled as rudimentary surgeons. That might sound surprising until you realise why. Who else had so much experience cutting into the human body? Barber surgeons existed, yes, but executioners were thought to have a knack for bones, ligaments and joints simply from practice. Dislocations, fractures and amputations were all part of their accidental medical portfolio. In some cases, they even specialised in removing arrowheads or treating wounds, not because they had medical training, but because people assumed someone skilled at cutting could also be skilled at patching. You can imagine the bedside manner. A man who just spent the morning torturing a thief now calmly setting your broken leg. Comforting. Executioners were also tied into medieval law enforcement in ways that stretched beyond the scaffold. They sometimes acted as torturers during interrogations, applying thumbscrews, racks or hot irons until confession spilled out. The process was not subtle, it was meant to terrify, and your presence was proof enough that the town meant business. Yet after the confession, you were still the outcast. Nobody thanked you for solving a case. They just avoided your eyes as you walked home, shoulders aching from a long day of extracting screams in a dungeon that smelled like mould, sweat, and iron. Perhaps the most peculiar of all was their involvement in handling human remains. Body parts from executions were not always discarded. Heads were mounted on spikes, limbs were nailed to gates, torsos were sometimes displayed in public squares as warnings. Who placed them there? You did. And if the display needed to be maintained, perhaps recoated with tar to keep it from rotting too quickly, that fell to you as well. Imagine tending to a decomposing head like it was a houseplant, a grotesque form of civic gardening, ensuring that justice continued to stink long after the sentence was carried out. The association with death gave executioners a kind of grim expertise in anatomy that spilled into medieval medicine. Human fat, called poor sinner's grease, was sold as a remedy for ailments ranging from joint pain to epilepsy. Blood from executed criminals was sometimes drunk fresh, thought to carry life force that could cure disease. Executioners became suppliers of this macabre medicine, legally entitled to portions of the bodies they dispatched. It was business layered onto punishment, a medieval supply chain that began with crime and ended in a doctor's jar. And if that seems disturbing, it is worth remembering that people bought it eagerly, seeing no contradiction between condemning criminals and rubbing their rendered fat on arthritic knees. Even the dirt of punishment became part of their trade. The ropes used in hanging, soaked with sweat and blood, were prized as good luck charms or protection against evil. People would pay dearly for them, turning your workplace leftovers into collectible items. It is a strange thing to picture, townsfolk recoiling from you in the tavern, yet slipping coins into your hand for a piece of rope that strangled a man an hour earlier. Disgust and desire, mixed into one economy of superstition. All of this work gave executioners an odd relationship with wealth. They were often richer than ordinary townsfolk, collecting fees not just for executions, but also for these bizarre extras. Yet they lived isolated, surrounded by symbols of decay. Their homes were sometimes built near gallows or outside city walls, places where nobody else wanted to live. Visitors were few, neighbours non-existent. Their money was considered tainted, as if the coins themselves smelled of blood. And so they ate and drank in solitude, rich in pockets but poor in reputation. a paradox that gnawed at them as much as the lice in their beds. When you imagine this life, the absurdity compounds. One moment you're hauling a rotting cow through a muddy street while townsfolk hold their noses. The next moment, a nobleman quietly sends for you to lance an infection or to deliver a vial of blood as medicine. Then at sundown, you're climbing the scaffold to swing the axe before a screaming crowd. All three moments are equally your job, and none of them grant you respect. Instead of being seen as a professional, you were marked as cursed, a man who carried society's filth in his hands and in his soul. And so when you collapsed into bed at night, the stench of death and tar clinging to your hair, you knew the nightmares waiting for you were not imaginary. They were vivid recollections of your daily routine. You could close your eyes and still feel the weight of a severed arm in your hand, hear the crack of a bone snapping beneath a torture device, smell the rancid rot of a horse in the street. Your mattress of straw and lice was hardly a refuge, more like an extension of the scaffold, carrying you from one day of grotesque duty to the next. But what makes this picture even more unsettling is not just what executioners did, but how they became executioners in the first place. The cursed profession was often inherited, forced or coerced, trapping families in a cycle of blood and exile that could last for generations. Your duties were strange enough, but what sealed the misery of your life was the fact that this was not simply a job. It was a profession that clung to families like a permanent stain, passed down whether anyone wanted it or not. If your father was the executioner, the odds were very high that you would become the executioner too. It was not talent or interest that decided your career path, it was inheritance. And in the Middle Ages, inheritance could be as binding as iron shackles. In cities like Nuremberg, Paris, and countless smaller towns, entire families were branded as executioner stock. Children were born into it with no choice, carrying the burden of their father's axe before they could even walk. Society labelled them cursed, and no amount of piety or good deeds could erase that. Imagine being 5 years old and already marked as the future wielder of the sword, your playmates forbidden from visiting your house because their parents whispered that even touching your toys might bring misfortune. The stain of the profession went deeper than blood stains. It followed the lineage. Marriage was another prison. Ordinary townsfolk refused to let their daughters marry into executioner families, fearing disgrace. As a result, executioner families were forced to intermarry with each other, creating tight and isolated dynasties. In Germany, there were entire clans of executioners whose family trees tangled with one another because no outsiders would join them. You were born to be outcast, raised to be outcast, and married into further outcast generations. Your surname itself became a scar, often whispered as a warning rather than spoken as a neighbour's name. And yet, despite the contempt, these families held a strange kind of indispensability. Towns needed executioners, desperately. Punishments had to be carried out. Law and order needed visible blood to enforce it. A city could not function without someone willing to swing the axe or light the pyre, and so the families remained protected by necessity. Executioners were often exempt from certain taxes, granted homes, or given land on the edges of town. Privilege and damnation coexisted side by side, a contradiction that medieval society tolerated with grim efficiency. Children in these families grew up in a world warped by duality. They were taught anatomy not through medical books, but by watching their fathers dismember corpses on the scaffold. They learned to sharpen blades before they learned to write their own names. Some were educated more than their peasant counterparts, because executioners needed to know law codes and judicial procedures. Yet all of that knowledge was locked inside the cage of their family status. They could never practice as doctors, never become priests, never pursue guild membership. Their education served only the gallows. This hereditary cycle also meant that reputations carried across decades. If a father botched an execution, the shame lingered on his sons. Villagers remembered, whispering tales of a badly severed head, as though it cursed the bloodline. Children grew up under the shadow of both their father's axe and his mistakes. The idea of social mobility, climbing out of the muck into a different life, was simply impossible. You could never escape the smell of tar, blood, and fire that defined your kin. One of the strangest details is that executioner families sometimes leaned into their role, collecting knowledge of human anatomy that rivaled early medical schools. They became experts in cutting, cauterizing, and handling wounds, even if their skills were learned in the cruelest classroom imaginable. There are records of executioners acting as healers within their closed communities, treating one another's injuries with grim efficiency. Ironically, the very people society shunned as cursed were often the only ones who could set a broken bone or stitch a gash properly. But their talents were not celebrated. They were feared, as if healing hands could not wash away the blood that paid for their bread. The hereditary curse even extended to geography. Executioner families often lived in designated quarters, sometimes called executioner houses, built deliberately on the outskirts of town. These places became synonymous with dread. Travellers might pass by and shudder, muttering prayers as they hurried along. Inside, children grew up surrounded not by laughter of neighbours, but by the smell of rusting iron tools and drying hides. Their play-yards were often the same grounds where gallows stood, their lullabies mixed with the sound of creaking ropes swaying in the night wind. The social exile had ripple effects in daily life. Executioners and their families often had to wear distinctive clothing when in public, a silent warning to everyone else. In some regions, they were forbidden from handling food in markets, their touch considered polluting. At taverns, they drank from separate mugs or were forced to stand apart. You could be wealthy, your pockets heavy with coins from the town council, but still sit alone at a bench while others refused to even share your air. All of this carved a permanent psychological scar across generations. Imagine being a child and knowing that no matter how kind, how devout, or how talented you might be, the world saw you only as the shadow of the scaffold. You might grow up dreaming of being a craftsman or a merchant, only to be told that your hands were already owned by the axe. The cycle crushed individuality, grinding down each new generation into a copy of the last, until all that remained was the rhythm of executions repeating through bloodlines like an echo across centuries. At night, when the children lay on their straw pallets, they could hear the same nightmares that haunted their fathers. The whispered voices of the condemned, the cheers of the bloodthirsty crowd, the sound of bones breaking under the blade. These were lullabies of the cursed, carried from one generation to the next. For some families, it lasted hundreds of years, an unbroken chain of nightmares that no one could escape. And yet, perhaps what makes this even more twisted is that society depended on the cycle. By forcing executioner families into isolation, medieval towns guaranteed a steady supply of men who could never walk away. They were bound to the work by blood and stigma, trapped forever in the paradox of being needed and despised. It was not just one man haunted by nightmares, it was entire dynasties. But beyond the hereditary curse, the daily grind of an executioner's duties included something far more chilling than swinging an axe or branding a criminal. Many were required to serve as torturers, presiding over dungeons where justice meant breaking the human body until it confessed. Torture was not some rare spectacle tucked away in the darkest corners of the Middle Ages. It was an official tool of the justice system, sanctioned by councils, bishops, and kings. And when the town needed someone to turn the screws, literally, there was no debate about who would do it. The executioner was summoned because in the logic of the time, who better to manage agony than the man who already lived in its shadow? Your role expanded beyond the public scaffold into the hidden chambers where confessions were carved out of flesh rather than coaxed from lips. The dungeon was not a place of shadows and whispers, at least not at first. It was loud. Screams bounced off stone walls, echoing through stairwells until they became the background music of justice. The smells were even worse. Damp air mixed with sweat, old straw soaked with blood, and the copper tang of iron shackles rusting on walls. Imagine being the man who not only had to operate the devices but also clean them afterward. The rack was not polished by servants. It was scrubbed by your hands, sticky with remnants of the last prisoner who confessed to whatever crime was demanded. Historical records show that torture was often highly procedural. Manuals outlined exactly how much pain could be applied, how long a prisoner could be stretched, and when to stop just before killing them. Town councils and judges sat in on sessions, making it feel less like a dark crime and more like a twisted business meeting. The executioner's role was to obey orders, turn the screws, heat the irons, and apply agony with precision. This was not chaos, it was choreography. The tools themselves read like an inventory from a sadist's workshop. The rack stretched bodies until joints dislocated, ropes creaking as limbs popped from their sockets. Thumb screws crushed fingers until nails split and bone crumbled like chalk. The strappado lifted prisoners by their arms tied behind their backs, wrenching shoulders out of place with a sound that lingered in the ears of everyone in the room. And of course, fire was a favourite. Heated irons pressed into skin, branding not just flesh but memory. You were the operator of all of it, the man whose job description was to turn human beings into raw confessions. Yet for all the horror, torture in the Middle Ages was wrapped in a cloak of legality. Confessions were considered the highest form of proof, and if a person would not confess, then torture made them confess. The circular logic was airtight to medieval minds. If someone screamed out their guilt while on the rack, the justice system considered it valid. Whether it was true or not mattered far less than the fact that a confession had been secured. You were less a bringer of truth and more a human pen, signing confessions onto bodies in sweat and screams. There was also the public expectation of theatricality. Even though torture happened behind closed doors, rumours spread, and townspeople relished hearing about the devices and the agony. Executioners became infamous not just for executions, but for their reputation in the torture chamber. Some were said to have developed particular specialties. A twist of the rope here, a precise burn there. Entire identities formed around the artistry of suffering, turning you into both craftsman and monster in the eyes of your community. The effect on prisoners was predictable, but the effect on you was corrosive. You spent hours listening to pleas, bargaining, lies and shrieks until they blurred together into one endless wail. The sound of a person breaking under pressure is not a single scream, it is a chorus of cracks and sobs that stains the inside of your mind. When you finally stumbled home at night, half drunk to dull the ringing in your ears, the echoes still followed. The chamber was never silent, even when empty. What is most disturbing is that this practice was not hidden shame but civic duty. Councils recorded torture sessions in official documents, noting times, methods, and even the prisoners' cries. You were not a rogue tormentor but a municipal employee following procedure. Some executioners were paid extra fees for torture duties, turning agony into a kind of overtime bonus. You did not just earn your keep with executions, you padded your income with screams. The absurdity stretches further when you realise how fragile the process was. A prisoner might confess under torture, retract under rest, and then confess again under the next round of pain. Truth itself became elastic, stretched and broken like the bodies on the rack. But the law did not care. Your job was not to find reality, but to manufacture confession. And in that strange equation, agony equaled justice. The worse your nightmares became, the more society convinced itself that it was functioning properly. Even your tools told their own stories. Shackles worn smooth by countless wrists, ropes frayed and stiff with dried blood, irons blackened from repeated heating. These were not anonymous instruments. They carried memory. Each time you gripped a crank or tightened a screw, you knew dozens had done the same, leaving pieces of themselves behind. The dungeon was a museum of torment, and you were both curator and performer. The psychological toll of this duty seeped into everything. Sleep was a cruel trick. You would close your eyes and feel phantom weights pulling at your arms, phantom cries whispering through the rafters of your home. The lice in your bedding became metaphors for the guilt that never stopped crawling. You drank to numb it, but alcohol made the dreams more vivid, turning flickers into reels. You were haunted by the bodies you broke as much as the ones you executed, and still, society could not do without you. Torture was the scaffolding of medieval law, propping up a system that needed visible suffering to feel secure. Without the executioner, justice could not grind forward, confessions could not be harvested, order could not be maintained, and so you remained trapped, indispensable and reviled, your nightmares feeding directly into the machinery of the courts. What makes this all the more grotesque is that executioners themselves often became experts in pain, not just applying it, but studying it. Some wrote notes on how long certain methods took, which joints dislocated first, which burns left the deepest marks. They built a field of knowledge on suffering, a grim science passed through families and whispered among colleagues. It was not medicine, not art, but a craft all the same, and you were its unwilling craftsman. When dawn broke and the dungeon finally fell quiet, you would climb the scaffold once again, trading shadows for daylight. Yet the screams did not vanish. They rose with you, echoing through the square, blending with the crowd's cheers you raised the axe. Nightmares followed you from chamber to square, from bed to pyre without pause, and the very next day the council might summon you again to the dungeon, ready to begin the cycle anew. But there was another horror that made the life of a medieval executioner even more grotesque than racks and irons. Beyond torture and blood, you were also responsible for the public theatre of death, staging executions not simply as punishments, but as spectacles designed to entertain, terrify, and instruct entire communities. Executions in the Middle Ages were never quiet affairs. They were not carried out in some hidden courtyard behind stone walls. They were spectacles staged in the very heart of town, drawing crowds as large as any festival or market day. Your role was not only to kill, but to perform. The scaffold was a stage, the condemned were unwilling actors, and you, the executioner, stood as the lead performer in a grim play everyone pretended was about justice, but secretly attended for the thrill. The atmosphere on execution day was closer to a carnival than a courtroom. Merchants sold food, drinks and trinkets to the gathering crowd. Children sat on shoulders, eager to glimpse the moment when steel met flesh. Vendors hawked pastries while preachers shouted about sin, creating a bizarre soundtrack of sugar and damnation. For many peasants, executions were the only form of live entertainment they would ever see. It was theatre, morality lesson, and blood sport all in one. The logistics were immense. Scaffolds had to be constructed and inspected, gallows erected in public squares, stakes prepared for burning. Tar was brought to preserve severed heads for long display. You were at the centre of all this preparation, ensuring that every part of the event worked smoothly. If the axe slipped, if the rope snapped, if the fire fizzled, it was not simply an inconvenience. It could spark a riot, as the crowd demanded both justice and spectacle in equal measure. Historical accounts show that executions could last hours, even days, depending on the sentence. A nobleman might be beheaded swiftly, but thieves, heretics, and traitors often faced drawn-out punishments designed to maximize spectacle. Quartering, burning, and mutilation were not only penalties but public lessons. The more shocking the death, the more effectively it stamped fear into the minds of onlookers. Your skill as an executioner was measured not only by your accuracy, but by your ability to deliver this grotesque performance convincingly. The pressure was enormous. A clean strike with the axe was rare. The human neck is not an easy target, especially when swinging in front of thousands. Botched beheadings were common, leaving you to hack repeatedly as the crowd howled. Some shouted encouragement, others jeered, but all were transfixed. Chroniclers describe occasions where it took 4, 5, even 10 strokes to finish the job. Each blow echoed not only in the square, but in your memory, replayed endlessly each night when you closed your eyes. Hangings were no easier. The weight of the condemned could break a rope or dislodge a poorly tied knot. sending the victim crashing to the ground in front of a furious audience. When this happened, you were expected to hoist them back up, adjust, and try again. Burning at the stake too was unpredictable. Wet wood smoked rather than flamed, choking spectators with acrid fumes before finally igniting. The condemned writhed in agony while the crowd muttered impatiently, as though waiting for a sluggish street performer to finish his act. There were also strange rituals woven into these performances. Before executions, prisoners were paraded through town, forced to confess their crimes publicly. This march served as both humiliation and advertisement, drawing bigger crowds to the main event. Sometimes executioners carried banners or symbols representing the crime, turning punishment into pageantry. It was part morality lesson, part medieval reality show, and you were the reluctant star. One overlooked detail is how executioners had to maintain control of the condemned even in their final moments. Prisoners often resisted, spitting, cursing, or collapsing to avoid the noose. It was your job to manage their bodies, sometimes beating them into compliance, other times dragging them up by brute force. The crowd wanted drama, but not too much. Disorder threatened the illusion of justice. So you stood there, equal parts killer and choreographer, making sure the show went on without collapsing into chaos. The economics of spectacle were undeniable. Towns invested heavily in execution days, knowing the event attracted merchants and visitors. Some rulers deliberately staged executions during fairs to guarantee massive audiences. This blending of punishment and profit made execution central to civic life. Your job was as much about entertaining the crowd as enforcing the law. You were both a servant of justice and an unwilling showman, trapped in a role that earned you coins but stole your soul. The impact on your psyche was relentless. By day, you heard cheers as you ended lives, as though you were applauded for skill with a tool no sane man wanted to wield. By night, the applause twisted into mockery, replaying in dreams as the crowd roared at your failures. Even when you succeeded, it was not mercy they admired, but the efficiency of death. You were celebrated and despised in the same breath, adored only when your axe was sharp and your hands steady. The absurdity becomes clearer when compared to modern entertainment. Imagine the tension of a modern sporting event, the roar of the crowd when the ball crosses the line. That same energy pulsed through medieval squares, but the goal was not a ball in a net. It was the severing of a head, the crack of a neck, the hiss of flesh meeting fire. Justice became theatre, and you were the player who could never leave the stage. And when the execution ended, the show was not truly over. Heads were mounted on spikes, bodies left dangling as grim reminders. The square did not empty in silence. People lingered, gossiping, pointing, even posing for what we might call medieval souvenirs, cutting bits of rope or wood from the gallows to take home. Death was not only entertainment, it was consumable, collected like relics, and you ensured the supply was steady. As you stumbled home after these performances, the crowd's voices still ringing in your skull, you knew that tomorrow could bring another. For the medieval world was never short of crime, sin, or accusation, and punishment remained the favourite pastime of justice. But beyond the roaring squares and scaffolds, executioners also carried the responsibility of what came after. The disposal of bodies, the grotesque business of scattering, burying, or displaying the remains of the condemned, was another nightmare that defined your profession. The show did not end with the fall of the axe or the tightening of the rope. In many ways, it was only beginning. Once the condemned had taken their final breath, the true nightmare of your work began. Because medieval justice was not about ending a life quickly, it was about displaying that life's end as a warning to everyone else. And who was in charge of arranging these gruesome exhibitions? You, the executioner, caretaker of corpses, manager of remains, and unwilling decorator of the town's most public spaces. Severed heads were the most iconic trophies. After a beheading, it was your job to take the dripping skull, sometimes tar it to slow the rot, and mount it high above the city gates or marketplace. tar preserved the skin just enough to keep the features recognisable, turning the head into a grotesque billboard for crime and punishment. Travellers entering the town would be greeted not by banners or arches, but by rows of blackened faces, grinning down with rictus smiles. It was civic advertising at its most macabre, and you were the sign maker. Limbs had their own destinations. Arms might be nailed to wooden posts along roads leading into the city, fingers pointing stiffly like grotesque signposts. Legs could be displayed at crossroads to remind passers-by of the fate awaiting thieves and traitors. In some cases, bodies were quartered and each piece sent to a different town, spreading the message of punishment across an entire region. You were not only an executioner, but a distributor of body parts, as though managing an inventory system of flesh and bone. The logistics were as grim as they were absurd. Bodies had to be transported, mounted and maintained. Birds picked at the soft parts, dogs tried to gnaw at dangling limbs, and the stench of rotting flesh spread for blocks. It was your task to climb ladders and resecure slipping heads, to repaint tar over sagging features, to keep the display horrifying enough to deter but intact enough to still be legible. Imagine a man balancing on scaffolding, hammer in hand, adjusting a half-rotten arm that keeps falling loose. That was part of your daily duties. Mass executions created even bigger problems. Dozens of corpses might be left swinging on gallows after a large roundup of criminals or rebels. The spectacle worked for a day, but within hours the bodies began to bloat. Flies swarmed, and the stench rolled across the town like a fog. Eventually you had to cut them down and drag them to pits outside the walls, sometimes burning them, sometimes burying them shallowly in earth. Rain uncovered bones, scavengers dug up remnants, and still the town pointed at you as the source of corruption. You were both the cause of justice and the caretaker of decay. There was also the strange market for execution remains. Ropes used in hangings were sold as charms, thought to bring luck in gambling or protect against illness. Teeth, bones, and even nails were sometimes pried from corpses as talismans. In parts of Europe, blood from the freshly executed was believed to cure epilepsy if drunk while still warm. All of these bizarre demands fell into your hands, making you part of a trade network in human scraps. You provided not only justice but a form of medieval merchandising, each piece of the condemned recycled into someone's superstition. One chilling example comes from London's infamous London Bridge, where traitors' heads were displayed for centuries. Your predecessors stood on that bridge, tarring and mounting the skulls of men whose names echoed through history. The heads decayed slowly in the open air, eyes eaten out by crows, mouths yawning open in silent screams that greeted every boatman drifting down the Thames. You were the man behind the display, ensuring that death continued to speak long after life had ended. The bodies themselves could also be used in medical or legal experimentation. Executioners sometimes dissected corpses to study anatomy, a rare opportunity in an era when cutting into bodies was otherwise taboo. Scholars and physicians occasionally stood by to watch as you split open a chest or pulled back skin, turning a public punishment into a crude anatomy lesson. What horrified the crowd fascinated the learned few, and again you were the one who had to bridge the gap between horror and knowledge. And yet, despite all of this grotesque work, the credit was never yours. No one thanked you for climbing a tower to hammer a skull into place. No one nodded in appreciation when you hauled a sack of rotting limbs to the edge of town. Instead, they wrinkled their noses as you passed, whispered that your touch was cursed, and crossed themselves when your shadow fell over theirs. You were vital and reviled, irreplaceable yet shunned, forced to carry the stink of decay not only on your hands but in your very identity. The absurdity becomes clearer when you picture the contrast. By day you staged justice as a spectacle, delivering the drama of axe and rope before a roaring audience. By night you became a janitor of death, hauling away heads and reattaching slipping limbs, hammering nails into rotten flesh while the town slept. The crowd never saw this part, but it was the piece that haunted you most. The scaffold might echo with cheers, but the pits outside the walls echoed only with silence and rot. When you crawled back into your lice-ridden mattress after a day spent climbing ladders with sacks of human remains, the nightmares came easily. Faces blurred together, mouths whispering in dreams, limbs twitching as though still alive. You closed your eyes and still saw them swinging, still smelled the acrid mix of tar, smoke and decay that clung to your hair. The nightmares did not fade with time, they multiplied, each new body joining the chorus. And as your profession expanded beyond justice into decay, it revealed another disturbing truth. Executioners were not simply killers, they were civic symbols, carrying out rituals that society depended on but did not want to acknowledge. You embodied the paradox of medieval life. Justice meant rot, order meant spectacle, and morality meant displaying bodies like grotesque decorations. But even beyond the bodies left hanging and the skulls nailed to gates, executioners carried one more responsibility that left scars deeper than tar or blood. For in addition to killing and displaying, they were often required to serve as reluctant healers, treating the sick and injured with the same hands that had ended lives hours before. The same man who split bodies open by day could be called on to stitch them back together by night. Executioners were paradoxes wrapped in human form, both destroyers and healers, killers and surgeons. Townspeople would not touch you, would not drink with you, and would not marry your children. But when they broke a leg or took a knife wound that threatened to fester, suddenly they came knocking at your door. Your reputation was cursed, but your skills were undeniable. It makes a certain grim sense. You spent every working day cutting, burning and breaking human bodies. You knew where the joints connected, how much pressure tendons could take before snapping, and which arteries spilled quickest when severed. Anatomical knowledge was rare in the Middle Ages. Surgeons were scarce. Physicians clung to their theories of humours, and priests frowned upon dissection. Yet you, the executioner, knew the human form with a precision that no book could rival. It was knowledge carved into your memory with every blow of the axe and every twist of the rack. That expertise turned you into a strange kind of folk healer. In Germany, records show executioners lanced boils, set broken bones, and even carried out amputations. They applied poultices, stitched wounds, and cauterized injuries with the same irons they once pressed into criminals. People came in secret, ashamed to admit they trusted you, yet desperate for help. Some arrived at night, cloaked and hooded, sneaking into your home on the edge of town as though visiting a sorcerer. They whispered their ailments and prayed that nobody saw them seeking healing from hands stained with blood. Executioners even developed their own pharmacies, remedies made from herbs, animal parts, and disturbingly often from the remains of the executed, were part of their repertoire. Human fat was rendered into salves for joint pain. Powdered bone was mixed into concoctions meant to treat illnesses. Blood was used in elixirs, believed to carry vitality. You were not simply a healer, you were a dealer in remedies born from death. To modern ears it sounds monstrous, but to medieval patients it was hope in a jar. The irony is that these same people who shunned you in the marketplace would gladly smear poor sinners' fat on their skin, or swallow draughts laced with blood, never pausing to question the hypocrisy. You were treated like a curse in life, but transformed into a necessary evil when illness struck. The same executioner who had just nailed a head above the city gates might later in the week be thanked in whispers for curing a child's infection. Justice and medicine shared the same filthy hands. In France, there are accounts of executioners being sought out specifically for their knowledge of fractures. Soldiers returning from war, bones shattered by swords or arrows, sometimes limped to the executioner's home rather than to a physician. Why? Because executioners knew bones. They had broken them deliberately, stretched them apart on racks, snapped them with hammers. They understood the sound and feel of a bone under stress. Setting one was simply the reverse of breaking it. You became, unintentionally, an expert in orthopedics. Some executioners even built reputations as miracle workers. Townspeople might publicly sneer at your name, yet quietly spread word of your successful cures. There were cases where executioners ran small clinics from their homes, balancing their roles as feared killers and trusted healers. It was not uncommon for them to be consulted by nobles in secret, asked to treat wounds too embarrassing or delicate to be shared with an official physician. You became both untouchable and indispensable, a paradox that left your mind spinning long after you crawled into bed. And what was your payment for this double life? Not respect, never respect. At best, you received coin, slipped across a table in silence. At worst, you were accused of witchcraft if your cures failed. You carried the blame for every infection that spread, every limb that rotted after amputation, every patient who died under your care. Unlike doctors, who could blame the imbalance of humours, you were not allowed excuses. You were cursed if you healed and cursed if you did not. The psychological toll of this role was staggering. You could end one life in the square before noon and save another in your hut by evening. The contrast was maddening. You were caught between roles so contradictory that they began to blur. At night, your dreams became surreal collages. A condemned man screaming on the rack transformed into a patient begging for stitches. Blood pooled into both chalices and gallows pits. You were haunted not only by the deaths you caused, but by the lives you saved, because each one tied you further into a role you could never escape. The absurdity reached its peak when your healing skills were called on during executions themselves. If a prisoner fainted before their sentence was carried out, you might be ordered to revive them so the crowd could see the punishment completed. Imagine sprinkling water on a man's face or tightening a bandage on his wound, only to drag him back up to the scaffold seconds later. You were healer and killer in the same instant, patching a man just enough to ensure he could be destroyed again properly. The legacy of executioner healers lived on for centuries. In some regions, executioner families became known for their medical remedies as much as their punishments. They passed down recipes for ointments and techniques for setting bones alongside their axes and swords. The knowledge was valuable, but the stigma never faded. Even when they saved lives, they were still barred from guilds, churches, and respectable society. Healing did not wash away the blood, it only mixed with it. As you staggered home after one of these double shifts, hands raw from cauterizing wounds, mind spinning from the screams of both criminals and patients, you collapsed into a bed that smelled of tar, sweat, and decay. The straw creaked beneath your weight, lice scuttled through your hair, and exhaustion pressed down like a stone. But sleep did not bring rest. In your dreams, the condemned and the cured merged together, faces twisting in gratitude and hatred, voices whispering blessings and curses in the same breath. You woke more tired than when you lay down, trapped in a cycle that blurred mercy and cruelty until neither made sense. And beyond the strange role of healer, there was yet another burden. Executioners did not only deal with flesh and bone in the square, they also presided over ordeals, those bizarre medieval trials where guilt was decided not by evidence but by fire, water, or molten metal. And once again, you were the man forced to oversee them, turning superstition into law while knowing full well that the results were often fatal. Superstition was not just a part of medieval justice, it was the backbone of it. When evidence was scarce and logic even scarcer, the courts turned to divine judgment. Trials by ordeal were the preferred method of deciding guilt, and you were the man expected to orchestrate them. If God was believed to tip the scales, you were the one holding those scales in your bloody hands. The most common ordeal was trial by water. A suspect would be bound and tossed into a river or pond, and their guilt or innocence was judged by whether they sank or floated. The twisted logic went like this. If the accused floated, the water rejected them because of their sin, and they were guilty. If they sank, the water accepted their innocence, though of course by the time anyone hauled them back up, the innocent often drowned anyway. Your role was to bind the accused, carry them to the water's edge, and shove them in while crowds gathered to watch the drama unfold. You became the man who turned ponds into courtrooms and rivers into juries. Then there was trial by fire. This was less about swimming and more about walking. An accused person was forced to carry a red-hot iron bar for several paces, or walk barefoot across burning coals. The wounds were then bound and inspected days later. If the burns healed cleanly, the person was declared innocent. If they festered or blistered, they were guilty. Of course, medieval bandages were dirty, and infection set in quickly, meaning most wounds looked like open invitations to bacteria. Your job was to heat the irons, prepare the coals, and sometimes even wrap the wounds afterward, as though cruelty could be neatly packaged in linen. The ordeal of boiling water was even more theatrical. A pot was set to boil, and the accused had to plunge their hand into the scalding liquid to retrieve a stone or ring from the bottom. The hand was then wrapped and examined days later, with the same questionable inspection system. You were the one stirring the pot, literally, waiting for the water to bubble before guiding a trembling hand toward it. People crowded around not to pray, but to watch a human being burn for the sake of divine truth. It was justice by stew, and you were the cook. In some cases, ordeals involved molten metal. Hot lead might be poured onto the hands of the accused, or they might be forced to carry a lump of glowing iron. The pain was unbearable, the scars permanent, and the judgment entirely arbitrary. Yet towns trusted these rituals, convinced that God himself whispered through wounds. You kept the fire stoked, the metal glowing, the spectacle ready. It was your craftsmanship that turned superstition into civic ritual. The absurdity of ordeals did not stop with their methods. The entire system was riddled with contradictions. Float and you were guilty, sink and you drowned. Heal too fast and you were suspicious, heal too slow and you were guilty. Innocence was always one infection away from guilt. But none of that mattered to the crowd or the council. They wanted to see divine justice at work, and you were the man who made it visible, even when the outcome was death. Records show that ordeals were often held in churches or sacred spaces, further blending religion with punishment. Priests blessed the irons, sanctified the water, and muttered prayers while you prepared the tools. The congregation gathered not for hymns, but for the slow burning of flesh. Faith and fire combined in a ritual that blurred worship and execution. You were a servant of the court, but in these moments you also became a grotesque liturgist, officiating a ceremony of pain. The ordeal system lingered for centuries, and in some places it became so common that towns built permanent facilities for them. Executioners maintained the equipment, cleaning iron bars, repairing cauldrons, and sharpening knives that were used to carve bandages away from blistered skin. You were both caretaker and tormentor, keeping the theatre of justice ready at all times. No one else would touch these tools. They smelled of charred skin and divine judgment, and so they were yours. What is most striking is how eagerly people accepted these rituals. Crowds treated them as entertainment, laughing at the accused who squirmed on the coals, gasping as the skin seared and bubbled. For peasants, this was as thrilling as jousts or markets. For nobles, it was a convenient way to settle disputes without evidence. And for you, it was another layer of nightmare, because you had to watch every second and then live with the memory long after the crowd had gone home. The psychological scars from ordeals ran deep. You were not just an executioner, you were the gatekeeper of superstition. You saw how arbitrary the results were, how innocent people burned while guilty ones survived by chance. You watched as festering wounds were called divine judgment, when all you saw was poor sanitation. You knew the system was flawed, yet you were the one who kept it alive. At night, your dreams replayed the scenes, the smell of boiling flesh lingering in your nostrils, the sound of hissing water echoing in your ears, and still, the world demanded more. Ordeals were not the only spectacles you oversaw. Beyond fire and water, your profession was tied to executions that stretched into punishments designed not to kill quickly, but to prolong agony. And that meant you were often required to master the art of slow death, punishments engineered to drag out suffering in ways that made even ordeals look merciful. Quick deaths were a luxury in the Middle Ages, and they were rarely granted to common criminals. Most punishments were engineered to drag out pain, because the point was not only to end a life, but to make that end a lesson. Your job was not to swing cleanly, but to keep agony alive, to turn death into a process rather than an instant. That made you less an executioner and more a craftsman of cruelty, a technician fine-tuning the machinery of pain. Breaking on the wheel was among the most infamous methods, and it was your duty to carry it out. The condemned was tied to a large wooden wheel, limbs stretched and pinned. With an iron bar or hammer, you smashed their bones one by one, often following a set order outlined in local law codes. Arms first, then legs, then the spine. Each blow splintered bone and echoed across the square. The body was then left twisted around the wheel like some grotesque sculpture, displayed until the crows picked it apart. You were the sculptor, and your medium was human flesh. Burning alive was another tool in your grim kit. Fires were built high in marketplaces or outside city gates, and the condemned was tied to a stake in the centre. If the wood was dry, flames roared quickly, but if it was damp, the process stretched out into hours of smoke and suffocation before the fire finally caught. Some towns ordered you to strangle the victim before the fire reached them, a supposed act of mercy, though it was rarely granted. Most of the time, you were expected to tend the flames, adding fuel when they faltered, ensuring the crowd got the full show. You were less a killer and more a fireman in reverse, keeping the blaze strong enough to consume. Then came drawing and quartering, perhaps the most elaborate form of slow execution. The condemned was hanged until nearly dead, then cut down and disemboweled while still alive. Their intestines were pulled out and burned before their eyes, hearts torn from chests and displayed to the jeering crowd. Finally, the body was cut into 4 parts, each sent to different towns as warnings. Your role was central, from the initial rope to the final butchery, turning one human being into a series of grotesque parcels. It was justice by disassembly, and you were the operator. One of the crueler tasks was flaying, stripping the skin from a living body as punishment for crimes like treason. Records show that executioners sometimes peeled flesh from chests, arms and backs, leaving raw muscle exposed to the open air. The skin was occasionally nailed to city gates as a warning. You were not only a killer but a tanner of human hide, maintaining order by displaying flayed remnants as civic wallpaper. It was the kind of duty that clung to your hands long after you washed them. The crowd's appetite for slow death was insatiable. They came not only to see punishment but to savour it, as though each moment of suffering was part of a grand performance. Mothers brought children, vendors sold pies, and preachers shouted sermons while you hammered bones or stoked fires. For many spectators, executions were their theatre, their horror show, their moral lesson. You were the lead actor, and the condemned was the unwilling supporting cast. The absurdity of it all was that no one seemed to see the contradiction. They claimed it was about justice, but the cheers told you it was about entertainment, and there were always mistakes. A wheel strike that killed too quickly angered the crowd, who wanted their suffering prolonged. A fire that burned too fast disappointed spectators hoping for hours of torment. A rope that snapped mid-hanging turned a solemn punishment into chaos. Each mishap landed on your shoulders, proof that even in cruelty you were expected to maintain precision. It was not enough to kill, you had to kill correctly, matching the community's twisted sense of justice with perfect timing. The absurd rituals extended even into preparation. Law codes sometimes specified how many blows should be struck in a breaking, or how high a pyre should be stacked for a burning. You memorized these rules as carefully as any craftsman learned his trade. Too many strikes and you spoiled the show, too few and you cheated justice. It was a balancing act between efficiency and cruelty, and every mistake haunted you at night, replaying as vividly as the screams themselves. The toll on your body was immense. Breaking bones with iron bars left your arms aching. Hauling corpses to quarter them strained your back, and tending fires left your skin blistered. You were not a detached figure swinging an axe. You were a labourer of death, sweating, straining, and exhausting yourself in the service of punishment. When you stumbled home at night, you felt every blow in your muscles, every scream in your ears, every stench in your lungs. The nightmares that followed were not just mental but physical, replaying as aches in your bones and itches on your skin. And yet, for all the horror, these executions carried authority. They reminded the town who held power, who dictated order, and who demanded obedience. You were the hand that made that power visible, even as it destroyed you from within. The paradox was endless. Society needed you to perfect the art of slow death, but despised you for being the man willing to wield it. You were indispensable and untouchable, honoured in coin but shunned in spirit. When you finally collapsed onto your straw mattress, muscles still trembling from hours of breaking bones or hauling corpses, sleep offered no escape. Dreams dragged you back to the scaffold, to fires that refused to die, to bones that cracked endlessly under your blows. The nightmares were not inventions of your mind. They were memories replayed, stitched together into endless loops of pain. You woke each morning with sweat soaking your blanket, only to realise that the day ahead demanded more of the same. And beyond the stage of slow death, there were duties even stranger still. Executioners were often charged with policing brothels, supervising gamblers, and controlling the very people society claimed to despise. Once again, you became the man who managed society's filth, not only through death but through the regulation of vice. For all the horrors of the scaffold and dungeon, perhaps the strangest role you inherited as an executioner was that of moral policeman. When the town wanted its criminals punished, they sent for you. But when it wanted its brothels inspected or its gamblers watched, it also sent for you. You were both the symbol of sin and the man sent to control it. Medieval logic worked in strange loops, and none were more twisted than this. Prostitution was widespread in medieval Europe, and brothels were not only tolerated but sometimes officially licensed by towns. Yet someone had to keep order in these establishments, and naturally the job fell to you. The same man who nailed heads to gates was expected to supervise the behaviour of sex workers, regulate their fees, and enforce punishments when things got out of hand. It was a bizarre double life. By day you were feared. By night you were wandering through smoky rooms of straw beds and cheap ale, making sure the business of desire ran smoothly. Executioners were often granted monopoly rights over brothels, which meant they profited directly from the trade. In some towns, you collected rents from sex workers, or even ran the houses yourself, skimming a share of every transaction. The hypocrisy was glaring. Society called you cursed, unclean, and morally stained, yet the same society handed you the keys to its most profitable sins. You were the manager of vice, both punisher and participant, trapped in a contradiction that no priest's sermon could untangle. Gambling dens also fell under your control. Dice games, card tables, and other illicit gatherings were popular in every medieval town, and officials wanted them watched carefully. Who better than the executioner to serve as the enforcer? You patrolled these smoky rooms, a figure of dread leaning against door frames, making sure the town's cut was collected and that fights did not spill into the streets. The same hands that broke bones on the wheel now shoved dice into confiscation bags, as though the two duties were natural companions. In Germany, some records describe executioners being tasked with clearing beggars and vagrants from public spaces, lumping the poorer citizens together with sex workers and gamblers under the umbrella of vice. You became the sweeper of society's fringes, moving human beings around like refuse, enforcing order among those with no power to resist. Yet at the same time, you were just as despised as they were, shunned even as you collected coin from the very system that profited off their existence. The irony deepened when punishments within brothels or gambling houses were required. If a fight broke out, you might be called upon to rough up participants, or even carry out public floggings. Imagine the absurdity of being beaten by the town executioner in the same room where moments earlier you were rolling dice or haggling over services. For many peasants, their only direct encounter with you was not on the scaffold, but in these seedier corners of town where you loomed like a grim bouncer with municipal authority. There were also rituals tied to prostitution that involved executioners directly. In certain towns, when a sex worker was accused of breaking regulations, you were the one who staged public punishments. Women might be paraded through the streets, forced to wear humiliating costumes, or beaten at the pillory. The crowd jeered, vendors sold snacks, and you presided like a master of ceremonies, turning shame into another civic spectacle. Once again, justice blurred into entertainment, and you were at its centre. The hypocrisy of this arrangement was breathtaking. Officials condemned vice from pulpits and councils, yet they relied on its profits to fund town life. Brothels paid taxes, gamblers brought commerce, and you managed the flow like a grotesque accountant. Everyone despised you for your connection to sin, yet everyone benefited from the system you ran. Your presence ensured the business of vice continued under the thin veil of control, and your nightmares carried both the screams of the scaffold and the laughter of brothels into your straw mattress each night. What makes this role even more unsettling is that it further isolated you socially. If ordinary citizens already avoided shaking your hand, their disgust doubled when they whispered about your involvement in vice. Even when you were merely enforcing rules, the stain of immorality spread. You were marked not just as a killer, but as a man soaked in sin, cursed by association with the very people you were ordered to police. Yet without you, the system crumbled, and so the paradox continued. The absurdity becomes sharp when you picture a day in your life. In the morning, you swing an axe in front of a cheering crowd. By afternoon, you're breaking up a dice game in a smoky tavern. By evening, you're inspecting brothels, counting coins, and making sure the tax collectors get their share. You stagger home reeking of smoke, sweat, and sex, collapse into your vermin-infested bed, and wait for the nightmares to crawl in. They arrive quickly, whispering in the voices of gamblers and condemned men alike, laughter and screams mingling until you can no longer tell them apart. And the deeper truth was that your role as vice regulator only cemented your curse. You became the visible symbol of everything society despised but refused to eliminate. You represented death, sin, and filth, all at once, and no matter how vital you were to the machinery of medieval towns, you remained forever untouchable. Your profession was not simply a job. It was a cage that grew tighter with every duty, every coin, every scream, and every whispered accusation. But beyond vice and punishment, executioners were also called upon for a role even stranger, one that took them out of the brothel and the dungeon entirely. They were sometimes summoned to act as professional hunters of the supernatural, chasing witches, demons, and spirits in trials that blended fear, hysteria, and spectacle into one more grotesque chapter of your cursed profession. Medieval Europe had an endless appetite for sin, but it also had an endless fear of the supernatural. Demons, witches, and curses stalked every alley of the imagination, and whenever hysteria boiled over, the town turned to you. You were already seen as cursed, already steeped in death, so naturally you were the one asked to preside over trials that blurred the line between punishment and ritual exorcism. If a storm ruined the harvest, if milk soured, if a child fell sick without reason, the whispers always began. Someone was guilty of witchcraft, and you were the one who would prove it. The process began with arrest, and often the accused were women, though not exclusively. They were dragged to cells, interrogated, and prepared for trial. But a witch trial was not simply about words or evidence. It was about spectacle, about proving guilt through rituals of suffering that the crowd believed revealed the truth. Torture became the language of superstition, and you were fluent in it. You tightened ropes, pressed bodies, and listened to forced confessions spill from trembling lips. Water once again played its role. Suspected witches were bound and thrown into rivers, much like criminal suspects in ordeal trials. Float and you were guilty, sink and you were innocent, but probably drowned. The absurdity did not bother anyone. They believed water as a pure element rejected evil, so floating was a sign of guilt. You, of course, were the one pushing them into the current, watching them struggle and dragging them out if the crowd demanded another attempt. It was not about justice. It was about reinforcing fear, and you were the one who kept that fear alive. There were also the infamous witch markings. Interrogators believed witches bore the devil's mark somewhere on their skin, an insensitive patch that would not bleed if pricked. Who was ordered to search for these marks? You. With knives and needles you poked and cut into flesh, declaring innocence or guilt based on whether blood flowed. Imagine the absurdity of a terrified villager stripped in front of a jeering crowd, their skin examined inch by inch for a freckle or scar, while you jabbed them like livestock at market. Witch hunts became especially fevered in Germany, France and Switzerland during the later Middle Ages. Executioners there carried out hundreds of burnings, often in rapid succession. Accused witches were tied to stakes, surrounded by kindling and burned alive, their screams rising with the smoke while townsfolk muttered prayers of relief. The fire was not just punishment, it was purification, the belief that flame could cleanse society of evil. You tended the blaze as carefully as any ritual, stoking it when it faltered, ensuring the flames devoured every trace of the condemned. What makes it all the more grotesque is how profitable these hunts became. Confiscated property from the accused was often divided between officials, towns, and sometimes even executioners. The business of witchcraft accusations filled coffers as efficiently as taxes, turning paranoia into a revenue stream. For you, each trial meant another spectacle, another payday, and another nightmare. You could not refuse the work. To deny participation was to risk being accused yourself, and no man escaped the scaffold once suspicion turned in his direction. Superstition also bled into medicine. Some towns believed witches could only be destroyed if their ashes were scattered in rivers, or if their bones were ground into dust. You were the one tasked with managing these remains, ensuring that the ritual was complete. Just as you had nailed heads to gates and mounted limbs on walls, you now scattered ashes to the wind, transforming executions into exorcisms. The absurd rituals of disposal left your hands stained not just with blood, but with the residue of hysteria itself. The psychological toll was relentless. Every accusation was flimsy, every trial absurd, and every punishment grotesque. Yet the crowds demanded it, and officials ordered it, and you carried it out. At night you lay on your straw mattress, scratching at lice, remembering the smell of burning hair and the shrieks that never faded. Your dreams replayed the rituals, witches rising from flames in twisted visions, their mouths still chanting curses as you woke in cold sweat. Yet the irony of it all is that while you were feared as cursed, you were also treated as a necessary weapon against curses. Towns trusted you to destroy witches, even as they avoided your touch. You were considered unholy, yet you wielded holy fire. You were an outcast, yet you stood at the centre of every ritual meant to save the community from evil. The contradiction gnawed at your sanity, a constant reminder that in medieval logic, hypocrisy was not a problem, it was policy. Crowds loved these hunts as much as they loved public executions. They gathered in droves, children hoisted on shoulders, vendors selling food, preachers crying out against the devil. It was entertainment disguised as piety, and you were the showrunner. The condemned were props, the fire was the stage, and you played the lead role in a drama of fear. The absurdity was that the same people who bought charms and whispered superstitions about spirits in the dark were the ones shouting loudest for witches to burn. And when the fire died down, when the crowd drifted away and the ash cooled, you were left alone with the remains. A blackened stake, a pile of charred bones, and the heavy knowledge that tomorrow might bring another accusation, another pyre, another night of nightmares. Your life was not a series of events, it was a cycle, one you could never escape. But as cursed as witch hunting was, There was another shadow hanging over your profession that few ever considered. It was not only bodies you managed, but also the living condemned who awaited their punishment. For part of your duty was to guard, feed, and sometimes even comfort prisoners before their executions, an intimacy that added yet another layer of torment to your already unbearable existence. Your duties did not begin with the fall of the axe, they began long before. The condemned did not simply appear on the scaffold by magic. They waited in cells, pacing, praying, or sobbing, and you were often the one responsible for managing them in those final hours. This meant you lived not only with their deaths, but also with their words, their fear, and their last meals. It was intimacy of the worst kind, the kind that left stains deeper than blood. Medieval prisons were not the stone fortresses of Hollywood imagination. They were dungeons, cellars, and makeshift pits dug beneath town halls. Prisoners waited in straw that stank of urine, gnawed on scraps of food, and scratched at vermin that crawled freely over their bodies. You moved through these spaces daily, delivering bread, fetching water, and sometimes simply making sure they had not already hanged themselves with a strip of clothing before their scheduled execution. The irony was bitter. You were there to keep them alive, not out of compassion, but so you could kill them later in public. One of the strangest rituals you oversaw was the last meal. Not every town granted it, but many did, and it became a symbolic moment. Prisoners were allowed bread, meat, and sometimes even wine, the idea being that a full stomach made them calmer and perhaps less inclined to curse those around them. You carried the food, watched them eat, and then escorted them to the scaffold. Imagine the contradiction. Hours earlier you were lacing their wrist with rope, now you were pouring them ale and handing them chicken legs. It was hospitality wrapped in cruelty, a final supper with the man who would soon end your life. Executioners also played a role in confession. Priests might arrive to hear last words, but you were often the one standing silently in the corner, listening to the condemned beg forgiveness, or curse their accusers. These moments lingered in your ears long after the gallows were taken down. You did not just kill bodies, you collected the last words of dying men and women, carrying them with you into your nightmares. Sometimes you even had to prepare the condemned physically. That meant binding their hands, shaving their heads for branding or burning, or dressing them in simple white shirts meant for execution. You turned human beings into props for the public theatre of justice. Each act of preparation was intimate and grotesque, like a twisted parody of helping someone dress for a wedding. You knew that in minutes their clothes would be soaked in blood or smoke, yet you adjusted the knots and tied the cords carefully, because order demanded it. Historical records mention executioners calming prisoners, coaxing them to stand tall or walk willingly. A panicked prisoner was bad for business. They might thrash, delay the process, or anger the crowd. You became a strange kind of counsellor, whispering reassurances not out of kindness but out of necessity. Some even saw you as the last person they could speak to honestly, because by then everyone else had abandoned them, and so, absurdly, you became both executioner and confessor, killer and comforter in the same breath. There were cases where prisoners bribed executioners for quicker deaths. A clean stroke with the axe or a tighter noose could be purchased with coins or favours slipped to you before the event. Entire families sometimes pooled money to ensure their loved one's suffering was brief. You became a businessman of mercy, selling swiftness to those who could afford it, while the poor endured botched beheadings and slow strangulations. The scaffold became a place of economic inequality as much as legal punishment, and you were the man who enforced the price list. Not all prisoners went quietly. Some cursed you, spat in your face, or tried to attack as you tied their bonds. These moments were dangerous. You had to subdue them, sometimes with guards, sometimes with your own fists, all while the crowd waited outside for the performance to begin. By the time you dragged them onto the scaffold, you were already exhausted, your hands bruised, your mind rattled. Yet you still had to deliver the death cleanly enough to satisfy the crowd. The intimacy of handling prisoners seeped into your dreams. You saw their faces in the dark, heard their whispered bargains, and smelled the sour fear that filled the dungeons. You could not detach yourself from them because you had lived in their presence before killing them. Their voices mixed with the cheers of the crowd, becoming a chorus that replayed endlessly as you lay awake on your straw bed. The paradox of your role was clear. You were hated by society, yet you were the last companion of those society chose to destroy. You were untouchable, yet you were the one touching, binding, feeding, and sometimes comforting the condemned. You were the man who turned human beings into displays, yet you were also the one who shared bread and silence with them hours before. The intimacy made the nightmares worse, not better, because it reminded you that the people you killed were still people, with faces, voices, and trembling hands. And beyond the condemned, there was another category of lives you managed, one even stranger than prisoners. Executioners were often tasked with handling animals, not livestock for slaughter, but beasts tied to trials, punishments, or gruesome rituals that the medieval world demanded. From hanging pigs to drowning dogs, your cursed profession extended even to the creatures that lived alongside mankind. As if killing people were not enough, medieval justice demanded that you also put animals to death. Pigs, dogs, horses, and even insects were dragged into courts, tried for crimes, and sentenced as though they were humans. The logic was bizarre, but to medieval minds, it made sense. A world that saw divine order in everything could not let a murderous pig go unpunished. And since you were already the man society used to handle, what no one else wanted to touch, it was your job to execute the beasts. Pigs were the most common offenders. They roamed freely through towns, snuffling in refuse piles and wandering into homes. On more than one occasion, a pig mauled a child or bit an unlucky villager, and suddenly the animal found itself in chains, hauled before a magistrate. Witnesses testified, priests muttered prayers, and the court solemnly declared the pig guilty of murder. Then came your role. You might be ordered to hang it by the neck in the town square, dress it in human clothing to emphasize its crime, or even burn it alive as a warning to other swine. The absurdity was complete. A pig that moments before was rooting for scraps was now swinging from a rope while villagers nodded in approval. Dogs were not immune either. If a dog bit the wrong person, especially a noble or cleric, it could be seized, chained, and condemned. Sometimes entire packs of stray dogs were rounded up and slaughtered for disturbing the peace. You carried out the sentences with the same solemnity as human executions, because the law demanded no difference. The dog's howls joined the screams of men and women in your memory, another sound that replayed in the endless loop of nightmares each night. Horses too could be tried, especially if they kicked or trampled their owners. In one infamous case, a horse was executed for killing a nobleman during a tournament. It was publicly hanged, its massive body suspended awkwardly from beams, while the crowd gasped at the sight. Who managed that grim spectacle? You did. Ropes snapped, hooves thrashed, and the sheer size of the animal made the punishment more gruesome than anything you had staged with humans. The absurd theatre blurred even further. Justice was no longer about men. It was about proving that divine order reached even into the animal pen. The logic extended further still. Rats were summoned to court for stealing grain, their absence recorded in formal documents. Insects were cursed from pulpits, tried in absentia for ruining crops. While you might not physically hang a rat in every case, the symbolic association remained. The world treated animals as legal beings, and you were the one expected to enforce the outcome when punishment turned physical. You stood at the intersection of law and absurdity, swinging an axe at pigs while priests preached about divine justice. The social impact of these trials was enormous. They reinforced the idea that crime was a stain that could not be ignored, no matter who or what committed it. To let an animal go unpunished would be to let disorder spread. And so, you became the enforcer of this bizarre logic. One day you were burning a heretic, the next you were strangling a sow, the next you were breaking up a dogfight by hanging the offenders. Each duty chipped away at your mind. not just from the cruelty but from the sheer absurdity of it all. Crowds treated animal executions with the same appetite for spectacle as human ones. Children hooted, vendors sold bread and ale, and people gawked at the sight of a pig dressed in trousers swinging from the gallows. These punishments became community events, reinforcing social order while doubling as grotesque entertainment. You were the ringmaster of this carnival, ensuring the rope held, the fire caught, and the performance was convincing. The psychological burden was worse than with humans. You could rationalize the execution of criminals however twisted the system. But animals had no understanding of law. They did not know why they were in chains, why the crowd jeered, why the rope tightened around their necks. Their confusion was plain, and you saw it up close. Each animal's bewildered eyes haunted you as much as the screams of humans. At night, your dreams filled with squeals and howls, blending with voices until you could no longer separate man from beast. The absurdity deepened when towns demanded symbolic punishments. Pigs might be whipped in public for minor offences, or goats branded for wandering into gardens. These rituals required you to handle animals in front of laughing crowds, your every movement reinforcing the strange belief that punishment itself kept the world in balance. You were less a man of law and more a performer in a cosmic theatre, where even beasts had to play their part. It was not only the act of killing that wore on you, but the logistics. Hanging a pig was no easy task. Their weight tore ropes, their thrashing made scaffolds collapse. Burning a horse created such a stench that people gagged, yet you had to stoke the flames anyway. The grotesque physicality of these punishments stuck with you as much as the screams. When you trudged home afterward, the stink of charred hide clung to your clothes, lingering in your nose long after you lay down. And society's hypocrisy was on full display. These same townsfolk who condemned pigs for murder happily slaughtered them for bacon days later. They cursed dogs in court yet relied on them for guarding fields. They hanged horses for trampling nobles but prayed for their strength in battle. Justice and superstition wrapped themselves around daily life in absurd knots, and you were the one forced to cut them, again and again, until your soul felt as splintered as the wheel you used on traitors. As you scratched at lice under your blanket that night, your mind replayed the day's spectacle. A pig in human trousers swinging above a jeering crowd, a dog whimpering as the rope bit into its neck, a horse thrashing as flames rose around its body. These images stitched themselves into your memory, another layer in the endless quilt of nightmares that defined your profession. Sleep was no refuge. Dreams mixed squeals with screams, laughter with sobs, until you awoke sweating, dreading the next duty. And yet, beyond even the grotesque rituals of animal trials, your cursed work dragged you into another realm of punishment. For executioners were not only killers of men and beasts, they were also gravediggers and corpse handlers, forced to manage death from beginning to end, digging pits, carting bodies, and ensuring that disease did not overwhelm the town. It was never just about swinging an axe. Once the body dropped, once the head rolled, once the shrieks of the crowd faded, there was still the aftermath. The body had to be dealt with, and more often than not that responsibility landed on you. Few men were willing to handle the corpses of the condemned. Even fewer wanted to dig graves in soil heavy with clay and rock, where the smell of rot clung to the air and seeped into the ground. But the executioner had no choice. You were society's hand in death, and the duty stretched long after the moment of killing. Burial was not always dignified. Criminals rarely earned proper graves. Instead, they were tossed into shallow pits, left to decay in sight of everyone as a warning. Gallows hills became charnel grounds, littered with bones from decades of hangings, a gruesome reminder that law was written not only in parchment but in rotting flesh. Sometimes you were ordered to cart bodies to cemeteries, where priests muttered reluctant blessings. Other times you simply left the corpse swaying on the rope for weeks, a black silhouette against the sky, birds tearing at its eyes, while the town grew used to the sight. When plague swept through, your role only expanded. Entire towns fell silent as carts creaked under the weight of the dead. The wealthy bribed anyone they could to avoid the filth, but in the end, it was always you who stepped in. You dug trenches long enough to hold dozens of bodies, stacking corpses like firewood, sprinkling lime over them to keep the stench from overwhelming the living. The work never ended. By the time one pit was filled, another was needed. The gravedigger's shovel became as essential to you as the axe or the rope. Handling corpses was not simply disgusting, it was dangerous. Medieval Europe had little understanding of disease, but everyone sensed that rot carried risk. Miasmas, they believed, spread sickness, and to stand knee-deep in pits of the dead meant breathing the very fumes of contagion. Some executioners wore crude masks stuffed with herbs, though most had nothing but rags and luck to keep them from falling ill. Your hands cracked from digging, your clothes reeked of decay, and your nights were filled with dreams of clawing hands rising from the soil to drag you into the same pit you had just dug. It did not stop with humans. When a town faced outbreaks among livestock, the solution was often mass slaughter. Cattle were culled, pigs stabbed, sheep driven into pits, and you were expected to shovel lime over their bodies just as you did with people. Disease did not discriminate between man and beast, and neither did the grim duties assigned to you. The stench of burning animals joined that of human rot, a mixture so thick that villagers stuffed flowers into their noses to endure it. You could never escape it. The stink clung to your hair, your beard, your bed. Bodies themselves posed challenges beyond smell. They swelled with gases, split apart at the seams, and sometimes exploded in pits when left too long under the sun. Dogs and wolves prowled the edges of burial sites, clawing up shallow graves, dragging limbs into the open. More than once you had to chase scavengers away from half-buried corpses, clubbing them while trying not to gag at the sight of gnawed bones. These were not rare horrors. They were routine, the daily reality of death in a world without clean cemeteries or organised disposal. The executioner's house often became a storage space for death as well. Dissected limbs from traitors were salted and kept until they could be nailed to town gates. Skulls were boiled to remove flesh before being mounted on spikes. Your home, already avoided by neighbours, smelled of iron, smoke, and decomposition. Children whispered that ghosts lived in your walls, and truthfully, even you began to wonder. How could the souls of the condemned not linger, trapped between the gallows and the grave, between the wheel and the pit? Society made sure the horror was unending. Certain criminals were denied burial altogether, their bodies chained to posts as perpetual warnings. You had to maintain these displays, reattaching dangling bones, replacing rotting rope, ensuring the corpse remained visible long after the flesh had fallen away. It was a duty that blurred the line between executioner and curator of death, as though the town required you to keep a museum of misery on permanent display. Even the church complicated matters. Executed criminals were often denied burial in consecrated ground, so you had to enter them in barren fields or crossroads, believed to confuse restless spirits. The irony was sharp. People feared the souls of the condemned would return to haunt them, yet they forced you to bury bodies in the very places spirits were most likely to linger. If ghosts walked Europe's roads, it was partly because you had been ordered to leave their corpses beneath the dirt where every traveller passed. What little protection you had came from superstition. You might scatter herbs in pits, hang charms from your shovel, or mutter prayers while covering the dead. Not because you believed they would save you, but because when you are waist-deep in corpses, you cling to any scrap of ritual that eases the weight. And yet, no charm could erase the reality that you were as much a prisoner of death as those you buried. At night, when you finally staggered home, you carried the grave with you. The taste of lime lingered on your lips, the smell of rot in your hair. Even your dreams became burial grounds, filled with pits that never emptied, shovels that never rested, and hands that pulled you down into the soil. If execution by axe haunted you, burial by shovel consumed you. The work was endless, and the nightmares had no end. And as if dealing with the dead were not enough, another nightmare awaited. For you were also expected to deal with the living criminals not yet dead. Torture was part of your job, and the tools of that craft filled your chamber as much as ropes and shovels. When the last grave was filled and the shovel set aside, the work was far from finished. Death was not always delivered quickly in the Middle Ages. Often it had to be coaxed out slowly, pulled from the body like thread from a fraying cloth, and that responsibility fell to you. The executioner was not only a killer, you were also a torturer, the one called when the courts demanded confession, when the church required proof of heresy, when rulers wanted pain to do the talking that words would not. Torture was an art of practicality disguised as justice. The idea was that suffering could strip lies from the tongue, as if truth lay buried under layers of flesh and could be pulled free by stretching, burning, or crushing. Of course, the reality was that people would confess to anything once their joints began to separate or their skin blistered. But no one wanted to admit that pain produced unreliable answers. Instead, they clung to the belief that agony purified, that torment peeled away falsehoods, and that you, with your instruments, were the surgeon of honesty. The tools themselves were a world of nightmares. The rack, perhaps the most infamous, stretched bodies, until tendons snapped like overstrung cords. Wooden rollers pulled in opposite directions, arms and legs tugged so far apart that bones dislocated with a sound that was part crack and part scream. Few survived more than a session or two without permanent injury, and yet the rack was not considered execution, only persuasion. When the joints gave way, the pain was expected to pry open the truth. Another device was the strappado. Victims were hoisted into the air by their arms tied behind their backs, then dropped suddenly so their shoulders wrenched from their sockets. The sound of ligaments tearing was as much a part of the process as the cries. Some were left dangling for hours, their bodies twisting while muscles tore under their own weight. You had to be both strong and careful. Too much force and the prisoner might die too soon. Too little, and the crowd accused you of incompetence. It was a grim balancing act, one that required you to know precisely how much agony a body could endure without ending altogether. Fire was another language of torment. Torches licked at flesh, brands seared symbols into skin, molten lead dripped onto bare chests. The logic was simple and cruel. Heat stripped away defiance faster than reason ever could. You became skilled in judging the difference between a wound that scarred and a wound that killed, because your job was not always to end life, but to prolong its misery. That was the true nightmare of being an executioner. You were not simply the final blow, but the long drum roll leading up to it. Of course, there was also water. Long before the term waterboarding ever existed, medieval courts used methods of simulated drowning. Prisoners were held beneath buckets, mouths forced open while water poured down their throats. Gasping became choking. Choking became thrashing, thrashing became silence. To be suffocated not by ropes or blades, but by the simplest element in the world, was a punishment both efficient and terrifying. You were expected to know when to pull them back from the edge, reviving them just long enough to begin again. Then came the wheel, a punishment as theatrical as it was painful. Limbs were broken one by one with iron bars, the body threaded through the spokes until it resembled little more than a mangled puppet. Victims could linger alive in that position for hours, sometimes days, left on public display as birds plucked at their wounds. The executioner's role here was not only to inflict but to arrange, bending the human body into grotesque shapes that served as warnings. It was carpentry of the cruelest sort, and you were expected to master it. None of this came without consequence. Torturers rarely lived long lives free of pain themselves. Constant lifting, pulling, and striking left you with aching joints and strained muscles. The psychological toll was heavier still. The human brain is not built to listen to screaming day after day without fracture. And yet, the executioner was denied sympathy. You were a tool, not a man. If the screams followed you into your dreams, no one wanted to hear about it. They only wanted you to be ready again in the morning. Inquisitions across Europe elevated torture to ritual. The church sanctioned agony as a pathway to salvation, believing that torment could cleanse the soul even as it shredded the body. The paradox was absurd. By torturing, you supposedly offered the victim a chance at redemption, though redemption came most often just before death. The irony was not lost on you, but pointing it out would only earn you suspicion. And suspicion in the hands of inquisitors meant you might find yourself on the wrong side of the rack. Spectacle played its part too. Torture was often conducted in public, with townsfolk gathering as if for theatre. Children pressed forward, merchants sold food, and priests muttered blessings as bones snapped. Entertainment was woven into punishment, and you were the unwilling performer. Execution was not only an act of law, but of drama. Each scream was a note in the symphony of fear meant to keep order in societies where literacy was rare but pain was universally understood. Even the instruments themselves were burdens you carried. You had to maintain them like a blacksmith tends to tools. Iron bars had to be heated and hammered back into shape. Wooden frames cracked under strain and required repair. Ropes frayed, pulleys rusted, and torches burned low. An executioner's chamber was as much a workshop as a place of punishment, and unlike the blacksmith, whose craft built ploughs and swords, your craftsmanship served only to refine misery. Over time, the weight of the role became its own punishment. Villagers shunned you, refusing to sit near you in church or sell to you in markets, and yet they were eager to watch you work. They cheered your skill when you extracted confessions or displayed mastery of torment, then crossed the street the next morning to avoid your presence. You were a paradox in human form, both feared and needed, both despised and relied upon. The nightmare of being a medieval executioner was not only the act of killing, but the precision of cruelty required before it. Your hands became steady not because you enjoyed it, but because hesitation made it worse. Torture was not chaotic rage. It was organised, structured, sanctioned, and demanded. You were less a man than a mechanism, a cog in the machinery of medieval justice, built to administer the kind of pain most could not even imagine. If you enjoyed this little bedtime parade of medieval misery, let me know in the comments what you'd like to hear next. More kings, more plagues, or maybe something even worse. And if historical suffering helps you drift off, be sure to check out my other videos, because there's always more discomfort where that came from.